Channel 5 Had a Rough Night by Sam Mardick.
National Weather Service in Morristown has issued a tornado warning for Anderson County, Knox County, Morgan County, Rowan County until 9:45 p.m.
This all happened quite a few years back. The only reason I'm writing about it at this point is because, well, I've grown tired of bearing the story alone. And my therapist said I could only have closure if I just admit the truth. I've accepted what happened, but I'm gonna share all the glaring issues that have been keeping me up at night. At this point, I write this to just clear my conscience and to walk away from that night forever. Channel 5 has been around since the 70s. It had the same studio head since its founding. The station serviced a small area, mostly rural counties and communities. Our viewership was still pretty decent, but by those days, we made a lot of revenue by posting our links to our social pages. The future of journalism. Now Channel 5 is not the actual channel, and most of the names will be changed, but it's the only way I can probably tell this legally, or even safely. I'll also be paraphrasing a lot of the staff, jobs, and, well, the story in general to save space, so forgive me for any discrepancies in my explanation. The original Channel 5 building was on Main Street in one of the smaller areas of our town. However, a month before the incident, they finally finished construction on our new location. They had made enough bad calls on the weather to finally decide to relocate the Doppler to the center of the counties. The new building was immaculate. Clean tile floor instead of old red carpet. The walls were now a nice beige instead of wood paneling. And the new expansive Doppler sat atop the roof, finally predicting the weather correctly. There were a few downsides though. It was located basically in a swamp. We were way off the beaten path, a good distance from any of the towns or houses, yet still close enough to broadcast. We had to take a long road out of the nearest town, make a few turns, and finish the last half mile on a dirt road. They made plans to pave it eventually, but for now it was the only way in. Marshes were the only landscape in every other direction. Next, there was really no cell reception. However, the studio did have Wi-Fi, so it wasn't too much of an inconvenience. We also only had a few employees, due to our relatively small broadcast area. The good news was that we were fully independent, i.e., not slaves to the Sinclair Group or any other big media corporation that all wrote the same script for countless networks across the country. We had a decent and loyal viewership because of this. We ran ad campaigns that said, "Get your news honestly. We are completely independent and make you and the real news our priority," or something like that. We were on a certain local network, but they could have cared less as long as we were consistent and didn't use profanity. I only saw an executive once, as I had to come in early to rewire some equipment. A fat, jovial guy. I think it was his demeanor that let us get away with what we wanted. The inside of the studio began with 2 glass doors leading to a lobby. We had a security desk and a small metal detector, and a sign-in for any guests. You'd be amazed how many threats that anchors get, especially if we miss an affected area by a disaster. Once we had a man attempt to bring a knife in and assault us because he blamed our coverage for him losing his home in a flood. Past the security desk was a wide hallway with dressing rooms and offices. I shared a room with 2 of the other tech guys, and at the end of the hallway were 2 heavy green doors marked "On Air, Do Not Open." They stayed open during the evening parts that we were writing and setting up, and they were closed from 8 to 10 p.m., our time slot. Inside was the soundstage. It had a center crescent moon desk, a screen, and classy wooden frames. In front of the desk were the cameras and the crew. To the left of the large auditorium was the weather station. The station had a huge green screen, and, well, not much else. We had placed the frame directly onto the screen. To the right of the center desk sat our sports center, a small business-style desk in an athletic layout with a screen behind it. Directly above the stage entrance was a large loft with metal stairs leading up. It was enclosed and contained all of the tech and monitors and screen graphics, all that stuff. There was a window looking down to the set below. That is where I worked, with my buddy Dave and our supervisor, Mark. On this particular night, though, things were not going well for us. Half of the crew and interns couldn't make it in. The sports reporter and the field cameraman were just gone, for reasons that are soon to be apparent. And 3 of the worst scenarios were happening all at once. Earlier that day, there was a bomb threat called in at a local high school. It was horrifying, but we were all relieved to find out it was a false alarm. Either way, we had to report it that night. People were in upheaval since they wanted word on updates. I think that they had caught the person who set it up. Next was a homicide in the nearest suburb. The victims were 2 teenage boys. In what was assumed to be a botched burglary, the parents found them each with a bullet in the back of their head. It was probably the worst tragedy that the town had ever seen. The suspect was apprehended pretty soon afterward. Now, say what you will about news being corrupt, but again, we're self-owned. It's not fun or exciting or career building to have to look at images of dead kids for hours on end. The studio head, we'll call him Daryl, refused to air any of the pictures of the suspect. And it was decisions like that, which is why we all respected him. He wasn't about the juicy stories. He was about informing the public. One of the last real journalists. I digress. Basically, mood and morale were dismally poor. One of our interns called in due to a family member in the school. They were unharmed, but it was understood. Our sports correspondent was home since all of the games were shut down across the entire area. The other issue, the other reason half of our evening staff wasn't with us, was that some storms were forming. These storms were presumed to contain tornadoes. There was flooding in all of the lowlands, where many of our employees lived. Our studio was just high enough to be safe from flooding. But the same couldn't be said for the rest of the area. The warnings were already up before we even went on the air. Only 1/3 of our staff, about 8 of us, were able to make it in. It was just those of us who lived near the studio or had to arrive early. So the combination of depression, mind-bending stress had us all in pretty poor states of mind. We were bickering and rushing around. The atmosphere was beyond tense. Thankfully, there were only really 3 stories that needed to be covered: the bomb threat, the murders, and the storms. Most of the coverage would be weather alerts, so a skeleton crew could probably handle it. Our co-anchor, Susan, walked right into her dressing room and refused to emerge until she had to go on the air. She was your average female news anchor. She was in her early 30s, blonde hair, blue eyes, and a sharp manner of dress. Her makeup was great for the camera, but looked pretty thick in person. The other co-anchor, Bill, visibly had a drink or two in his system before even getting to the desk. Bill was another example of a model anchor. Tanned, late 30s, with sculpted black hair and a spotless black suit. I was up in the loft with the rest of my team. My tech boss, Mark, was announcing our jobs in quick succession. Mark was in his 40s, slim, and always wore khakis and a polo shirt. His balding hair and thick black glasses made him look like... well, they made him look like the embodiment of his job. He was pointing and speaking commandingly. I was trying to watch the weather map like a hawk, and I was to post all updates to our social media accounts. I used headphones to hear the radio transmissions from the emergency transponders and direct any radio calls. The anchors signed on and expressed a brief condolence and encouragement to help the victims' families. They then said they had to focus on a current threat. Tornado warnings were popping up everywhere. The dank and thick swamp foliage outside was pretty upsettingly calm. Like the calm before the storm kind of calm. The night was black as pitch already. It was Morgan, our weatherwoman, who took over the broadcast. She was of Haitian heritage and had some pretty long-lasting roots in the area. She dressed in classy dresses and had a complexion that was so perfect she barely ever wore makeup on the air, and she had silky hair past her shoulders. I honestly would have asked her out if she wasn't so brutally out of my league. She was warning residents in the affected areas to evacuate or find shelter. She motioned to every red spot on the green screen behind her. More and more spots seemed to pop up every moment. I stared unblinkingly at my screen of the live map. All of us had sweaty palms. At the bottom of the stream was a ticker for every affected county. We were on for a solid 30 minutes, afraid to cut away from the weather. I couldn't hear anything but intermittent code and the occasional update from different alert centers. Then I heard something weird. It sounded like commotion and confusion. I looked up to see my boss leering down into the studio. "What's wrong?" I chimed. Before I even finished asking, Mark sprinted away from the room and dashed down the stairs. I ran to the window to see what was unfolding. Mark, the security guard, and Daryl were all dogpiling on some random person. I looked at my buddy Dave, who read my mind and turned his screen towards me. It was a rewind of what just occurred. The feed, thank God, was cut to commercial. However, the cameras picked up all the clattering and slamming of feet until a young man came dashing into frame. The anchors were frozen in shock. The man was a young black man in a blazer, white button-down and slacks. He was pretty sharply dressed, but he appeared dusty and dirty. In the same motion of leaping onto the stage, he slammed both of his hands onto the desk and screamed right into the anchors' faces. "You can't stop it. They are coming. He is coming. You will," and he was tackled by the guard. The two hosts had reeled back and began coughing for a moment, but they quickly recovered. The man had been brought down hard in the meantime. They pinned him and the security guard zip-tied his hands and feet together. They roughly yanked him up and dragged him over to the security area, where they waited for the police. Daryl insisted that the anchor cease, but they insisted that it was okay. They were rattled, but still professionals. They said that he was probably some sicko who wanted to scare viewers. It was probable. That's what we had to tell ourselves. Daryl, following the men, shouted back at us, "We're going back in 1 minute. Get it together." Morgan was completely stunned, mouth standing agape. "Morgan!" Daryl yelled and snapped her to attention. "Are you good?" She stammered, Are you good?" He stared calmly but sternly. He really wanted to know. She inhaled hard with both eyes closed. "Yeah." Mark burst through the back door to check up on us quickly. "Cut to Matt, make sure the ticker's updated. Get those headphones on." I obliged, but at this point, I had to keep one ear free so I didn't miss anything coming from downstairs. We kept going. Morgan managed to stay composed and signed in. She updated on the storm, but after a brief lull in the updates, she gave the focus back to the anchors. "Hello, everyone," Susan began solemnly. "We know that in this time of panic and fear, it's easy to overlook the tragedies and horrors that occurred earlier today." "Terror struck today," Bill said on his time. "While students were planning a normal day of school, instead they were met with horror and targeted knees. We thought nothing of the stutter or the mispronunciation." "That's right, Bill," Susan said, way too cheery. "The birds had sung and the sun is now shining upon our great southern landscape." This all made us look up. Now, what happened next is going to be hard to describe, but I'll try. It was the sound of madness. Not screaming, not shrieking, but madness. Their tones didn't change from the ones they had when they were describing a lifestyle piece. Cheery and well enunciated. If you take a moment now to look up the song Pina by Captain Beefheart, it kinda sounded like the beginning of that track. One would say a totally random statement, and the other would agree or add to it with a completely unrelated statement. Again, this exchange was done with an upbeat and campy back and forth. It began with nonsense statements and mispronounced words or just completely nonsensical words. But then, things got darker. "Badger's in the brook today, Bill." "Right, and the rain grows red." Their eyes close in the void. In the void. Your children are scum and probably not yours, Bill. "I'll rip your throat out, woman." Pause for smile. "Not if I get my thumbs into your eyes first, Bill." She held up her thumbs and looked at Bill with a fake threatening "ah" sound, shaking her hands. She turned to the camera and News laughed again. "The blood of the innocent, Susan. The blood of the innocent. They're coming for us, Bill. They will overtake us all. And to you viewers at home, you'll not outrun them. You'll rot where you stand." They both did that fake chuckle that newscasters do that end with a mutual, "ah." I left out quite a few lines, but they did get worse. After their hellish back and forth, they tapped their tapers and sat there staring into the camera, with smiles as if they were waiting for us to cut to commercial. They didn't move. They didn't even blink. "Oh my God," I said to the room. "I cut the feed as soon as I heard 'targetedly,'" Mark said, arms folded, not looking away from the window. I cued the emergency broadcast alert for the tornado warnings. Now it's that and just the map. Mark was smart like that. It's why he's our supervisor. Morgan was standing in front of the green screen, one hand over her mouth. Mark continued to us. "We'll keep it to the map and the recorded alerts until we can figure all this out." I checked my phone so I could check up on my roommate and my dog. But there was no Wi-Fi. The storm must have knocked it out. The studio was soundproof, but our booth was attached to the roof and there was a deafening pouring rain. "Hey Mark," I said, still looking at my phone. "The internet's out. I'm going to go to the office and check on the house. Can we take turns if that's okay?" "Sure," he said, not seeming to care. He was fixated on the scene before him. Everyone was. No one was moving or saying a word, just staring horrified at our two hosts. I quietly opened up the door to the booth and made my way down the stairs. We only had one camera operator. Earlier, he was dashing between cameras. Now he was just standing between Morgan and the news desk, a good distance away. The studio manager was standing by the lighting board, not sure what to do. All of them had pretty grave fear in their eyes. I opened up the studio doors and made my way down the hall. I was able to see into the lobby. The intruder was tied up in a waiting room chair. The security guard sat across from him, locked in a stare. Daryl was pacing. He kept saying, "What did you do? What did you do?" The man remained silent, his eyes fixated ahead, staring just blankly. I entered our office and grabbed the hardwire phone. It was completely dead. I tried in vain on other lines, but they were all down as well. We were completely cut off. It was only then that I knew why Daryl was pacing. The cops weren't coming. I decided to tell him that we were cut off, but as soon as I approached, he stopped me. "We can't reach anyone. Go check the server closet and see if you can do anything." The server closet was at the back of the studio. Our routers and lines for the office were all in there. It was just to the right off screen of the anchor desk. "Sir, I don't want to get that close." "It's out of the shot." "No," I replied. "I don't want to get that close to them." "What are you talking about?" We stared at each other for a moment. "Did you not see it?" I said, lowering my gaze. "See what?" Then I noticed all the screens in the lobby weren't on. They usually streamed the broadcast, but I guess he switched them off so the man couldn't see him anymore. The realization made me belt out, "You need to come with me, now." He was absolutely horrified at the sight. The anchor's eyes were growing more bloodshot as they still hadn't moved, hadn't even blinked. The other three were up in the booth. We walked in and Mark showed Daryl the footage. We expected leadership. We expected him to comfort us. Instead, our collective leader slammed the door open and rushed back to the hall. Mark followed close behind. "This is a fucking nightmare," the cameraman said. "What all could you see on the guy?" the studio manager, Sarah, asked. She was a short ginger lady who was pretty quiet unless she was giving assignments to the crew. I could see the absolute abject fear in her eyes. Not see, smelled. He winced as if he was still able to sense it. He had some sort of moldy tinge when he rushed past me. It was unique, like he made the smell himself. It wasn't BO or mud. I don't know, but it was pretty damn pungent. Morgan cursed under her breath. She walked out, and at this point we followed. We didn't want to be separated. Outside of the door, we heard commotion. "What did you do?" Daryl was screaming in the man's face. "What did you do?" The man remained just motionless. It was when we got closer that we witnessed something just horrifying. Daryl had reached into his belt and pulled out a pistol. The security guard leapt up to stop him, but Daryl shoved him hard to the ground. He pushed the pistol hard enough in the man's forehead with enough force to leave an imprint, and calmly but coldly said again, "What did you do?" "Stop!" Morgan cried out. He turned to us, snapping back to reality. He was studying our horrified faces. His face, which bore hatred and rage of a maniac, fell quickly to that of shame. He looked at the gun, then the man, and promptly stormed off to his office. We helped the guard up. Mark then came in from outside. He was absolutely soaking wet. He had a look of inescapable horror painted on his pale face. He looked at us and quietly stated, "All of our tires are slashed." We unraveled in panic as a group. "What do we do now? We're trapped? Oh God, oh God, oh God, what's gonna happen?" Morgan was the only voice of reason who calmed us. "I'll talk to him," she said flatly. "Give us the room." We turned to attempt to find Daryl. The last thing we heard as we made our way to the office was an unfamiliar greeting from Morgan. "Ayo Menem," she said calmly to the man. I couldn't hear the rest. Daryl was in his office, bottle in hand. His eyes were bloodshot. "Do you think now is the best time for that?" Mark asked, clearly disappointed. "Just make sure the damn broadcast is up," he shot back, staring at his gun on his desk. "The map is up. We're also intermittently running a generic warning, and the ticker is updated." "Then go make sure it stays that way," he said in a low, raspy voice. We exited the office to see Morgan pacing the hall. Mark didn't stop and grab the cameraman to return back to the studio. "What is it?" David asked. "Did he talk?" "Yeah," she said, wishing she didn't have to explain everything. "He said this is Move Paye," she said. "Bad country." "What does that mean?" David pried further. "It means that this land is cursed, at least according to him. He apparently knows all about the local voodoo legends. He said we're all gonna die because they wish it. We're a sacrifice. We won't last the night." It looked like tears were gonna stream down her face at any moment. "I don't believe in it," she continued, choking back fear. "But my mother did, and my grandmother. She was a godly woman who warned us of the swamps. But I never thought about it. Not until him. Not until tonight. Now, I don't even know what to think." Her hands were shaking as the stage manager told her to go to the dressing room. She said that she would stay with her if she wanted to, but she'd rather be alone. The guard was back in his spot sitting across from the intruder. So now it was David, the stage manager, and myself in the hall. We walked back to the booth to update Mark. David told him everything. Mark only quipped under his breath, "Hoodoo your voodoo, bitch." He chuckled, but no one else did. "Mark, we have to do something. We have to get the message out." "To who?" He turned with a cold expression. Clearly, he had already thought about this. "To the people hunkered in their basements? The thousands who already turned out and into the radio emergencies? What good could come of it? No one is coming. No one." "We should get Daryl and Morgan," David chimed in. This is when I let my emotions bubble. "What's going on?" I barked as if my colleagues had the answers. "Why are we not helping them?" Pointing angrily at the anchors. "Why are we paralyzed to help? What's happening to them? What is happening to us?" David gripped my shoulder and said, "Calm down," using his voice to try to reassure me. "We'll deal with them in time, but for now, we don't need to go near them, at least until we know exactly what's going on. Right now, we need to get Daryl and Morgan and figure out our next step." So the 5 of us returned to the hall. Neither Morgan nor Daryl wanted to leave their offices. It was then that we devised a regretful plan. "We need to leave," the security officer said. "How?" I asked in an irritated response. "Our tires are slashed and there's floods everywhere." "It's a half mile to the pavement. From there we can hopefully flag someone down, or at the very least find some cell reception. If we keep the water beneath our knees, we should be okay." He stared at the small group and finally asked, "Who's coming with me? We need folks to stay here and watch the guys, so someone needs to stay." David, Sarah, and myself decided to stay in the studio, while Mark, the camera operator, and the guard were going to rough it. These guys were all more fit than the rest of us, so it only made sense. They donned ponchos and flashlights and left the building. We stared in miserable silence at the tied-up assailant. None of us wanted to be within 10 feet of the man. We turned, still keeping a wary eye on him. It was then that we heard chaos coming from the soundstage. It was muffled, but the bitter silence of the building made it audible. We all rushed down the hall to see what had happened. I paused to slam on Daryl's locked office door, begging him to come out. He didn't respond, so I gave up and chased the other 2. I had no sooner opened the doors than I saw the sight that had frozen my peers. Susan was on top of Bill, both thumbs completely submerged in his eyes. He was shrieking like no human should ever shriek. It was the most unholy sound that I have ever heard. However, Susan was screaming too. Or at least trying to. Blood and spittle came out of her muffled cries. Bill was mercilessly gripping her throat. From the looks of it, he had burst several vessels. With one last sickening crunch, Susan collapsed, both of her eyes still encased in Bill's shattered corneas. Bill was seizing and screaming from pain, but it was cut short. With one last burst of consciousness, which I really cannot explain, Susan pulled one hand free, grabbed a 1/4-inch cord, and slammed it into Bill's burst socket, with a force that there's no way her small frame could even muster. Apparently, a 1/4-inch can pierce right into the frontal lobe given an unreal amount of force. Bill seized violently for a few seconds, and then they laid beside each other in this bloody silence. Sarah started vomiting, David ran out. I just stood there in horror. I was about to walk Sarah out of the room when we heard David scream at the top of his lungs, "Don't!" Then we heard a bang that resonated throughout the entire building. We opened the doors and ran to see what had just happened. The intruder was on the floor now. He had a thick pool of black-rimmed blood expanding around his head, all from a single shot that bore right through his skull. Apparently, it lodged itself inside his brainstem. Daryl wordlessly pushed past David, who had just experienced 2 traumas in the course of a few minutes. He entered his office and locked the door. We never saw him again. Or, at least, David and I didn't. We grabbed whatever heavy objects we could and barricaded him in there until authorities arrived. We tried one last time to reach Morgan. We told her to give us some indication, any indication that she was okay. She didn't respond. Sarah beckoned. "Morgan, come out or I'm opening the door." No response. Sarah, who had a key set for the entire building, opened the door. Morgan was there, but she wasn't there. She sat in her dressing room, lit only by the lights of the vanity mirror. We could see her face reflected in the mirror. She just sat there, head tilted downward, but eyes were up in a fixated, unblinking stare at her reflection. Her mouth hung agape, not in a surprise, but closer to a snarl. "Sarah, shut the door, now," I muttered. We stepped back and Sarah shut the door. She looked at the entrance and grabbed an old tarp from the utility closet. She briskly walked over to the corpse of the intruder and draped it over him. When she returned to our side, we all gave her blank nods. We didn't need to keep seeing it. We followed David, who walked wordlessly out of the office. We sat. We waited. We didn't speak. We just listened to the storm outside, all the while hoping for a rescue from this hellish reality. It seemed like time was just ticking away at our hope. The only thing that I realized was, the entire time we were being horrified, our station was broadcasting a regional storm map with smooth jazz playing. I was somewhat glad that the viewers were spared this nightmare. I can't imagine being one of those stories of some gruesome scene being shown live on TV. My train of thought was interrupted with a loud bashing noise. We peered out of the office to see Mark, standing in the entrance, soaked from head to toe, no flashlight in hand, and no one else with him. As we approached, he choked out through exhausted breaths. "There's something out there." We stared back, all waiting for his explanation. His shock was plain. He turned to the blue tarp and jumped back. Before he could ask, we told him what happened. He looked frazzled. In here with us was clearly as bad as outside. He was concerned about Daryl harming us, and we frankly didn't have an answer. We just hoped that he was trapped and no longer a threat. We went with him to our office. He sat shaking all over. Sarah gave him a blanket and some coffee. We were about halfway down the trail. He began staring beyond us into nothing. The guard and I were in front. The water was past our knees in a few places, but I kept thinking I'd either be swept away or found by a gator. We still had our lights, but it made almost no difference in the rain. We began to drift further and further apart. I was in the middle, barely able to see the light in front of me. The other two were completely out of sight. We were on his every word at this point, waiting on bated breath. I slowed my pace down so I wouldn't be alone if I went down, but I realized I wasn't being followed anymore. I yelled out, but with the rain there was no hope of anyone hearing me. At least that's what I thought until I heard a scream. A scream like all hell had erupted. I began wading towards the scream, calling out to whoever it was. He was breathing deep, really wanting us to believe him, but afraid that we wouldn't. I saw a silhouette in the bog. He was waist deep, screaming at something. Lightning lit up the whole scene for just a moment. Then again, those 2 split seconds were clear as day. I saw it standing over him. It was impossibly tall. It was black all over. Its head looked like a horse's skull, just covered in tumors. It was gnarly and ugly. It was reaching out with a massive arm. At the end were long fingers. And then more fingers. And fingers on top of that. It was about to take him. "Are you sure?" Sarah chimed in sheepishly. Mark shot back a look like she had slapped him. She looked at the floor pretty embarrassed. "I ran like a coward," he continued. "I turned and dropped my light and ran. I was slow waiting in the muck. I don't know how I made it back, but I did. The rain was heavy, but it had lightened up enough for me to see the lights of the building. I don't know what happened to the other guy." Suddenly, the doors burst open. We hustled back into the hall. The guard was standing there in the entrance, absolutely soaked to the bone. His poncho ripped and he too was without a light. His face was beet red. He was breathing so hard I thought he was going to collapse. His eyes looked coldly up at Mark. "You," he said through gritted teeth. He rushed at Mark, lifting him by the neck with both hands. "You left me," he said, his face contorting in hate beyond that of any normal man. Before we could move to stop him, Mark had slipped his shaking hand into his pocket and withdrew a straight razor. He pushed the blade forth in a fluid motion, slamming the blade into the side of the guard. He reeled in pain, screaming. Mark fell onto his knees, choking for air. We were all frozen yet again. Mark had grabbed the blade on the floor and stood to his feet, ready to kill again. The guard pulled forth his stun gun and zapped it once to try to intimidate. They squared off. Absolutely no intent on de-escalation. Before David could yell stop, they charged at each other, the taser connecting with Mark's neck. He screamed but didn't fall. The razor rammed into the gut of the guard. I'm not sure how much of his beer belly protected his organs, but we both knew that he was in severe pain. It reminded me of that biblical story where Ehud stabbed the fat king so hard that the blade disappeared into his stomach. They held each other in this violent embrace, grinding their weapons even deeper. "Run!" David said, seeing the guard looking past Mark at us, rage and violence still burning in his reddening eyes. The same red that Morgan, Daryl, and the anchors all had in theirs. We turned and bolted down the hall yet again. As I turned to the office, David cut me off. "They have the keys. Get to the loft." We were mere feet away from the studio doors when we heard 2 more doors open, almost in unison. We paused for a moment until we heard smashing against our barricade. Then a gunshot. Then another. Then another. A nightmarish, inhuman shriek filled the air, from whom I could only assume was Morgan. We kept running. never looking back. We burst through the doors and made an immediate left turn up the stairs. Sarah ran past us, ignoring our calls. She ran past the bloodied corpses of the anchor and hid behind the studio in the closet. We closed the door behind us and jammed a metal rod into the push handle. They were not getting in. David immediately began typing on one of the computers. I hid beneath the viewing window as to not draw possible gunfire. "What are you doing?" I whispered. "Hopefully saving us," he responded, not even looking up. Then I heard the emergency siren blare over the map, replacing the smooth jazz. The screen now had text over the map. "Emergency alert. Flooding and tornadoes in the area. Channel 5 news building is flooded. Send help. Send help. Send help." We sat there, holding our hearts and trying to calm down our hyperventilating lungs. After a moment of eerie silence, I peeked out the window. Smoke. "David? David?" I said, horror growing at the black clouds. He looked and was silent. We could see light emerging from the corridor, the unmistakable dance of flames. David, acting much faster than myself, grabbed as many cables as he could carry. He gave them to me and said, "Open the latch." Of course, I thought stupidly. The roof access latch was in the loft directly above us. Only a short metal ladder on the wall led to it. I climbed and slammed the metal door open. The rain immediately beat me mercilessly. As I was climbing out, David was close behind me. When I emerged on the roof, I realized the intention of the cables. I began tying them together, and I used the frame of the Doppler as my anchor. I looked around at the impossibly dark storm. I was looking for David. I called out to no response. I ran over to the hatch, fearing that he was injured. "David!" I screamed as he emerged, holding onto something in his hand. "Come on!" he yelled, relieved to see that I had the good sense to tie all the cables together. We tried to let ourselves down easy from the 4-story height, but I fell a good distance into the mud below. Thankfully, I was uninjured. We ran around the side of the building to our cars. We hid separately in the floors of our back seats. I laid there all night praying that no one would emerge from that hellish inferno, praying that Sarah would be okay, praying that a tornado would not come and toss us to our death. Morning finally came. I passed out at some point during the night. The drop in adrenaline combined with exhaustion had really taken its toll. I awoke to someone rapping on my glass. In my groggy state, it took me a moment to realize that it was a police officer. He was looking down at me, relief and concern across his face. Tears welled up in my eyes at that moment. The next part was kind of a blur. They had used some kind of special SUV to traverse all the mud, and they took me to a hospital. After I was examined and placed in a room, an officer came to talk to me. "I'm very sorry, son," he said genuinely. "I know the past day has been a living hell for you. I know you have a lot of questions, and I'm here to answer them. First and most importantly, your friends David and Sarah, they're safe." I heaved a heavy sigh of relief. I was so happy for that brief second. "But," he trailed, "no one else survived." "What happened?" I asked, still stunned. Not everyone could have died in that fire, and I know foul play accounted in several instances. "Well," he collected himself, obviously unsure of where to begin. "We spoke with David, and based off of what he told us, and the grisly state of several victims, we discovered the root of the problem, especially after the arson investigator confirmed it. There was a gas leak in the building. We think that methane from the swamp leaked up into the drainage system and burst a line. The violent and manic behavior of everyone was most likely caused by this. The intruder was a local hoodoo priest. Yes, but it didn't affect anything that night. It was just an unfortunate timing thing. He probably had planned to do something after slashing all your tires, but he couldn't finish it. We think the fire broke out when your boss fired off his gun. That's where the story seems to resolve itself." "What about that guy in the swamp?" I asked. "Mark said he saw something attack him." "Yeah," the cop trailed off. "We found him. That guy drowned, sadly. He must have gotten separated and stuck in the bog. The only thing above him was a damn tree. Your buddy Mark was already far too gone to realize it." I hung my head. This was bad country. That swamp was evil. We should have never built our station there. All the revolving door questions were answered. All but one. How did you find us? Did our message get out? Son, he said coolly, y'all stopped being on the air 10 minutes into the broadcast. That's the whole reason we knew to come out. Then I sat. I sat in silence until he left. Then I laughed. I laughed at the tragedy. I laughed at the horror and death that we all experienced. I laughed because if none of us had come in that day, all of my friends would still be alive. Now, if you want to end the story with an ending, stop listening. If you want more questions than answers, go ahead and continue. It's been a couple of years since the incident. A little over 4 years ago today. I had taken a generous settlement from the executives and moved up north to be with family. I got a decent job with the media corporation and moved on with life, though with a good amount of therapy. I had no luck contacting David or Sarah. I didn't attend any of the funerals. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. I was in my home on an ordinary day, which I finally learned to appreciate, but it was changed when I received an unmarked package. No return address and no delivery address. Someone had dropped it off. I was worried, but curiosity won out. Inside was a stack of papers and a cassette tape. On top was a note written to me. Hey man, I know we haven't talked since all that stuff went down. I imagine you got a pretty good bit of cash to live on. I did too. But I'm an idiot and I spent it all on this box you have. If I could do it all differently, I would. I wish I had just taken the cash and started over. Can't change the past now, though. If you look at these files, you'll find what I found. I know that the gas leak story was fine to live by, and I wish it were for me too. I was stupid enough to ask questions. I had my doubts. It all started during the fire. I was coming up the ladder behind you when I heard this shrill chiming song. It was about 20 seconds, followed by a tiny child's voice. He was reciting something. It was random words in succession. I can't decipher it, and I'm afraid to put it online. I was able to find this hooked up to our old tape backup. I don't know why, but I hid it from the cops. Next, the guy that came in was not a voodoo priest. He wasn't even capable of driving a car or basic tasks. He was a former patient at a psychiatric ward. I think someone put him up to it, terrifying us as a distraction. His only qualification seemed to be the ability to speak Creole. I also found it weird that the police were able to tell us exactly what happened, only a couple of hours later. They had all of the answers. I came to find out that they had met with some undetermined characters before speaking with us. They knew what happened. Then they changed it. I think we were a part of something. I think our building was somewhere where it shouldn't have been. The swamp played some part in it, I think, but I don't know if it's entirely to blame. The thing that bothered me is the only people that seemed to have lost their minds were the one within close proximity to that guy. They all snapped after being in his aura. The red eyes, the vocal shifts, they were all symptoms affecting them. I don't know. Keep the box and see what you think. Or don't. I don't care anymore. I'm finally getting out. I'm leaving the country for some work in Antarctica as a radar tech. I can't bear all these questions. Either way, I love you, man. I hope life treats you well. I'm sorry for dumping all this on your plate years later, but it's too valuable to waste and, well, you're the only person I trust with it. I'll see you when I see you. Wish me luck. David. I placed the box and the letter in the bottom of my closet. I'm moving on. Do what you want with all this, but this is it for me. I did what my therapist said and I'm done. I hope you never experience anything like I have. I hope you never venture into places that people dare not go. I hope you don't find creatures or magic or madness anywhere in your daily life. Just be safe out there. I would like to thank all of the lovely and amazing patrons who are currently listed on screen right now. And if you would like to be one of the patrons, make sure you head on over to Patreon. There's all types of rewards and whatnot over there. And I'm going to try to do 2 Patreon-only stories this month, but it's getting to the holidays, and I'm a very busy family man, so I will do what I can. I can promise 1, but maybe not 2. Dan R., Neophyte Games, Chaos X, Mr. Swiston, Official Jerboa, JY Pyromancer, Hayden MH, Ethan A., Daniel H., Maximilian Charles P., and Deneen H. Guys, thank you so much. I really do mean it when I say you do keep this channel alive. And also, make sure you support any other creators that you see out there. There's a lot of good ones that deserve your support too. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you stick around and follow me on Twitter at RealCreepSin. That is in the description as well.